Now, the planet Mars, as you all, I'm sure, are aware, is the fourth major planet from the sun. It's about half again as far from the sun as we are. It is named after the Roman god of war. And many people will naturally presume that that's just a question of a cultural tradition, that just as the ancients named a lot of things after a lot of their various superstitions and things, it's very possible, as we learn more about the history on the planet Earth of the antics of this peculiar planet, that we may come to the possibility that it was named very appropriately. You see, the strange thing about the planets in general and the planet Mars in particular is that it captured not just the imaginations of the ancient cultures, but gripped them with fear. Most of the early civilizations turn out, if you do your homework, you discover, were terrified of the planet Mars. Now, at first you figure, well, those are just superstitious civilizations. Those are people that for a variety of reasons, were afraid of everything. And these strange wanderers, that's what the word planet originally meant. Most of the stars, as you know, move in relatively prescribed, or appear to move rather steadily, because their movements are obviously caused by the rotation of the Earth. So they move in their particular paths very predictably. But there are a group of objects in the sky that move rather strangely, because they'll move along like a star for a while, but then they strangely appear to go backwards for a little while and then forward again. And this is why they were named the Wanderers, in effect. But the most dominant one, as you start studying this, at least in a cultural sense, is the planet Mars. Now, we know today, of course, that apparent motion is caused by the fact that they are on elliptical orbits around the sun just like we are. And when you start comparing those motions, that gives rise to this peculiar path that they described in the sky. But the observation that I'd like you to think about a little bit is the ancient cultures were terrified of the planet Mars. They worshipped it. The planet Mars is known as Baal in the Old Testament, and the priests of Baal. Now, the word Baal actually just means Lord, or it's a title in a sense. But you'll discover, if you do your scriptural homework, that God speaks frequently of the hosts of the heavens, referring to these things, not to worship these things. The priests of Baal had their particular altars and such on the high ground. Often you'll see in the scriptures that the idol worship was in the high places. You'll see the scriptures speak of groves. Now, the primary application of the groves were, in effect, phallic symbols, the gods or goddesses of fertility, if you will. There are some scholars that suspect possibly some of those groves may have been wooden examples of Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain in England. There's a monument quite famous as being one of the oldest monuments that's known on the planet Earth. Many scholars for centuries recognize that its architecture's lined up with the midsummer sunrise. But Gerald Hawkins made history by his book and the CBS special and the rest, where he apparently uncovered the fact that the Stonehenge lines up with not just the midsummer sunrise, but all the key positions of the sun and the moon. In fact, after he published his original papers and created a huge controversy, through a writing from a friend in South Africa, he made a further discovery that the mysterious Aubrey holes that surround Stonehenge also allow that structure to predict eclipses. Now, archaeologically, we know that structure was built over a 300-year period, strangely enough, and then abandoned. And when you do a mathematical analysis of its ability to predict eclipses, you discover that it predicts eclipses quite accurately, but it makes an error once every 300 years. And so you can only guess at the embarrassment of the priesthood that was in charge when it failed to perform as appropriate, and one can only guess as to what the circumstances were. The archaeological studies of Stonehenge, incidentally, also demonstrate that there was international trade with the British Isles in that Wessex period, which is about 1500 BC. And so the possibility that Britannia was, in fact, the source of tin that caused it to be called Tarshish in the Middle East is it's still a conjecture, but possibly a very plausible one. But in any case, the main point is The ancient cultures were very, very concerned with the planetary movements. Now, for them to be concerned about the year going by in seasons is understandable because that determined their agricultural success. And so there's much to do with trying to develop correct calendars. But as we start studying calendars, you discover something else that's rather strange. If you look at 14 different ancient calendars, the ancient Egyptian, the Assyrian, the Babylonian, the Hebrew, and the Etruscan, and you can go through a list of 14 of the ancient calendars. You notice something rather interesting about them all. While they had their differences, they all presumed a 360-day year on the planet Earth. And they apparently worked fine up until about 701 BC. In 701 BC, most of the calendars were revised, changed. The Romans added a few days, moving towards what we now know as our 365 and a quarter day annual calendar to get the solar calendar in step with the sidereal calendar. The Hebrews did a strange thing. They added a month every few years on a very strange formula. Now, you can find the rabbinical literature full of speculations. Why did King Hezekiah choose to that peculiar way of reconciling their solar year to the sidereal year? What no one writes about is why did they have to change it at all? What happened in 701 BC? It turns out one of the possibilities is that this was all due, strangely enough, to the planet Mars. So there's all kinds of mysteries associated with the planet Mars, and we're going to explore some of those, particularly ones that would impact us in our lives and understanding of the Scripture. Now, one of the things you should understand, of course, is that Mars was, of course, called Mars by the Romans, Indra in the Indian folklore, Tyr in the Teutonic, Tyr is the transliteration typically. In the Teutonic literature, the genitive form was Teus. And we're meeting right now on a Tuesday night. You may not realize that Tuesday is named after the planet Mars, after the Teutonic tradition, not the Latin or some of these others. Tuesdag was Tuesday. It's derived from the Sanskrit word divas, from which the Romans derived their word deus, or deity. It's interesting that the first month of the Roman year was named Martius, after the god of war. It's where we get the month of March. You say, well, wait a minute, I thought March was the third month in this year. Yes, but that was later. That was in about 364 BC. The Roman calendar was rearranged to make January 1st the first of their year. But prior to that, for some 4 centuries virtually, or more maybe, they had March as the first month of the year. It may surprise you to discover that in England, March was the first of the legal year until the year 1752. The Anglo-Saxons described March as the lengthened month. That's where we get lengthened monat, or the word for Lent. It comes from the lengthened month. Why is March lengthened? And we're going to suggest the possibility that a near pass-by of Mars was one of the events that God used to respond to Joshua's prayer in Joshua 10, where a day was lengthened. The days weren't long enough for Joshua's battle, so he prayed to God, and we have this bizarre reference in Joshua 10 about the long day. It may surprise you to discover that people with great scientific background take that very seriously and have computer models that tend to support it. Conjectures, but still provocative ones. In Scotland, January replaced March 1st in 1599, and in France, January replaced March in 1564 by Charles IX. You might also be interested to know that many ancient people, the Celts and the Druids, used October 31 as their year end. The Eve of Samhain, or pronounced different ways, but related to the worship of Baal, or Mars, and Ashtoreth, Venus. This may have dated from the catastrophe at Babel, the confusion of tongues in Genesis 11. There's reason to believe that. And there again, there's evidence to believe that the planet Mars was very much involved in that. And it's interesting that still after more than 1,000 years, the conquest of Teutonic tribes still leave us with the days of the week: Sundag, Mondag, Tuesdag, Odin's Day, or Mercury's Day, and Thor's Day, Jupiter's Day, and Freya's Day, Venus's or Ashtoreth's Day, and Saturn's Day. days of our week, interestingly, are named after the sun and the moon and the naked eye planets. Now, it's interesting that Mars is worshipped as Baal or Bel, and also as the calf in India. It's all tied together, strangely enough. The ancient cultures were terrified of the planet Mars. Why? Why would they worship the planet Mars? And the answer turns out to be that the planet Mars apparently interfered in their lives. It intervened in their lives. See, we would probably argue there's no group that are more space literate than we are. I mean, speaking as a culture over the centuries. We presumably would know more about space and astronomy than all the previous cultures, right? And yet I imagine there's very few of us in this room that could go outside and point to the planet Mars if your life depended on it. You know, it's something that even if you have a telescope, you probably have to consult the local astronomy magazine to figure out where to point it right now, because it moves so strangely, and it's not that important, even if you're interested in astronomy. And yet the ancient cultures trembled before Mars. We have today in our vocabulary the term martial arts. It comes from that original relation. Now, Mars, if you're an astronomer, is fascinating for lots of reasons because it happens to have a surprising number of similarities to the Earth. Not as many as Venus. Venus is about the same size and has a number of its peculiarities. But Mars has a number of peculiarities that are very bizarre, not the least of which is its angle of spin and its spin rate. It's within 2 or 3% of the Earth. And in fact, Donald Patton, who will be with us later this week, and we'll be doing some interviews with him, and we do feature his book in our newsletter. And in our recommended library, we have Don Patton's book, Catastrophism and the Old Testament. He's one of these scholars. Most scholars you probably can partition in two groups: those that believe in evolution and uniformitarianism, that things have always been here, no beginning kinds of people. And that's pretty much discredited by modern science practically, but still becomes the myth of our culture. And there are others are what would be called fiat creationists, that this all happened in an instant when God said so, it happened. And they may be right, but there is a middle view called catastrophists, which say that yes, God created it, but there's a number of evidences that it wasn't always the way we see it now. If you look through a pair of binoculars at the moon, you can tell that it's been beat up pretty badly. The solar system's a pretty rough place. As we send space probes to all the planets, we notice that their surfaces are incredibly pockmarked. There's been a lot of catastrophes in the past. How long, we don't know. Some of them have occurred in the memory of man. There are over 100 large meteorite craters on the planet Earth, but most of them are hard to find because of erosion and climate effects. But in some of these bodies that have no atmosphere or any other form of erosion, these craters, of course, remain through extended periods of time. In any case, Mars has been a fascinating planet for many, many reasons. In fact, after the invention of the telescope, many features of the Martian surface — see, Venus has an atmosphere, it's pretty thick. Some of the other planets are further away and harder to see, and they're also, although very large, very light. The planet Jupiter would float in your bathtub if it was large enough. It's lighter than water. But Mars has a lot of features on it that you can almost see through a modest telescope. And that gave rise to much controversy. In fact, Italian astronomer and statesman Giovanni Virginio Schiaparelli is famous because he observed about 100 of these features starting about 1877, and he described them as canali, which is a term in Italian meaning channels. Some of these features apparently were perceived as being lines. And it was U.S. astronomer Percival Lowell, of all people, very well-known astronomer, that became the leader of those who believed the markings to be bands of vegetation bordering irrigation ditches dug by intelligent beings to carry the melting ice caps on Mars, carry water down to its deserts and so forth. When you look at Mars, it's easy to start, it's not that clear, it's easy to start imagining things that you see with it, and some of the features on the Mars tend to be suggestive of these things. However, all these controversies that raged for many decades finally were resolved when the orbits of Mariner 6 and 7 in 1969 took pictures and showed that there was nothing representing a network of channels. There are lots of pockmarks and other features, but nothing that finally buried those ancient myths of canals on Mars. But another part of your Mars background that some of you in this room may remember or certainly have read about is the peculiar antics of Orson Welles, who had a group what we called the Mercury Players. They attracted national notoriety in 1938 when they produced a series of programs based on H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. And one of their performances used a format of a simulated news broadcast which announced an attack on New Jersey by invaders from Mars. And they announced up front that this was just a simulation, a form of dramatic performance. But many people who were listening to another popular program at the time during the commercial, as they did in those days, switched to see what else was on. So they encountered this program after the disclaimer up front. And it was so well done, they thought it was really a series of news broadcasts. And they heard the announcer being strangled to death by these invaders and so forth. And it caused major panic on the East Coast of the United States. There were suicides, there were people jumping off buildings, there were heart attacks. It was actually a gigantic tragedy, but it caused mass panic. And, of course, has become a major part of history, Orson Welles and the planet Mars. We'll talk more about Mars, but let's get at the thing that's probably bothering many of us. Because on August 6th of 1996, from the headquarters of NASA in Washington, D.C., release number 96-159, released at 3:45 in the afternoon, was a statement from Daniel S. Golden, the NASA administrator. Now, I want to point out this is not some tabloid writer. This is not a tabloid you'd pick up the checkout stand of your newspaper. This is not just an announcement by some spokesman. This is a press release by the head of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. It's my private suspicion it's a release that he's going to live to regret. But in any case, it's brief. Let me quote it for you. NASA has made a startling discovery that points to the possibility that a primitive form of microscopic life may have existed on Mars more than 3 billion years ago. The research is based on sophisticated examination of an ancient Martian meteorite which landed on the Earth some 13,000 years ago. The evidence is exciting, even compelling, but not conclusive. It is a discovery that demands further scientific investigation. NASA is ready to assist the process of rigorous scientific investigation and lively scientific debate that will follow this discovery, and indeed has already started. I want everyone to understand that we're not talking about little green men. These are extremely small single-cell structures that somewhat resemble bacteria on Earth. There is no evidence or suggestion that any higher life form ever existed on Mars. The NASA scientists and researchers who made this discovery will be available at a news conference tomorrow to discuss their findings, and they will outline the step-by-step detective story that explains how the meteorite arrived here from Mars, how they set about looking for evidence of long-ago life in this ancient rock. They will also release some fascinating images documenting the research, which indeed they did. Now, what's behind this release? A group of 9 researchers from 5 different institutions, led by NASA researcher David S. McKay of the Johnson Space Center, published a study that claimed evidence for life on Mars, which created quite a stir. This publication was scheduled to be released in Science magazine on August 16th. But news started to leak out, and so Science magazine finally released it earlier. Now, they argued that the best explanation of 3 different minerals and organic residue and bacteria-like structures found together in the meteorite that, while found in Antarctica, is reported to have been blasted from the surface of Mars, and that it represents ancient life on the famed planet. Now, to get a little perspective here of what we're dealing with, the scientists were working with a slice of the meteorite that is 1/500th of a hair in diameter. You're talking itty-bitty stuff here, okay? Now, the laser analyzers help the researchers detect organic chemicals called PAHs. The initial is PAH, for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs is the short slang for it, in the meteorite. See, when living material degrades, it leaves behind polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And it's a very polite term. You can tell what it sounds like, okay? PAHs are common in the universe, but they're not always linked to living material. The conclusions assume that PAHs are indigenous to the meteorite rather than from earthly contaminants. That's another issue. Compounds are ubiquitous on the Earth. They're all over the place. They're formed not only by the degradation of living things, but they also by power plants, and they also follow automobile combustion. And I don't see any press release saying they've proven that there are cars on Mars, by the way. You know, if I said that these objects were suggestive of a car somewhere on Mars, you'd laugh at me. And yet, an automobile engine is vastly simpler than even the simplest living cell. One of the things that may startle you, unless you've done some reading in microbiology, there is no such thing as a simple cell. The simplest cell we know is like a gigantic factory that's more complex than you can conceive of. There are master records that are copied to provide the instruction to all the machinery. The machinery changes form as it needs to. There are provisions to correct errors, and on it goes. The model of the living cell is staggering in its complexity. And yet it's interesting, you know, the concept that a car might be on Mars is absurd, and yet the car is more complex than what they're assuming is on Mars. But let's go on. By the way, something you should understand, meteoriticists, people who study meteors, have been misled by contamination before. In the 1960s, a few researchers reported that a meteorite had yielded organic matter that appeared to have been biologically produced, along with microscopic organized elements, presumably fossils of the organisms that produce the organic matter. And after heated polemics and lots of controversy, it all turned out to be earthly contamination, including degraded ragweed pollen masquerading as alien life forms. And because of that bad experience, many scientists today are, just to give them credit, they are very, very cautious. They don't want to be burned again. And as they read these results, the press releases and internet correspondence is full of many very competent people saying, time out, guys, not so fast. Let's examine what you're really talking about. And you should, in fairness to the scientific community, there are many people that are far more cautious than some of the other articles you see that are, Carl Sagan has said this puts, you know, to silence this whole idea of the fall of man and all these absurd, ungodly extrapolations by some. But let's continue. Now, it's possible that some of these paws are indigenous to meteorite. There are many explanations for them that don't require life. Meteoriticist John Carriage of UCLA points out that decomposition could certainly produce polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, but there are dozens of other mechanisms that also produce paws. They could have formed from simpler compounds on Mars, which have never evolved chemically to living organisms. Now notice all this so far presumes it really did come from Mars. Who knows? It gets more complicated. The NASA researchers reported that golden-colored particles in the meteorite contained chemical and organic particles which suggested bacteria-sized organisms living on Mars 5.6 billion, that's with a B, billion years ago. I'm always impressed with the precision of these estimates, you know. The NASA researchers also found tiny sausage-shaped particles that, these are not just microscopic, they're submicroscopic. They're electron microscope issues you're dealing with here. McKay interpret them as fossilized microbes because they resemble ancient bacteria found on Earth rocks. Well, I thought this was an Earth rock in the first place, but let's go on. Kenneth Nielsen of the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee points out, quote, none of this can distinguish between biology and chemistry. Nielsen, whose work on bacterial carbonate precipitation is cited by McKay and his colleagues, he notes that warm fluids circulating through the Martian crust might have deposited the same sequence of minerals without any help from organisms. I love this warm fluids thing. You run into that. There are no fluids on Mars. The atmosphere can't hold it. Now, there's a huge mystery on the planet Mars. We'll get into this probably next time. But the planet Mars, if you examine the surface of it, bears evidence of gigantic floods. There's erosion, substantial erosion. The shape of the erosion is very visible from the photography. And yet there's no water because it doesn't have the gravity to hold it. Now, Don Patton has made the interesting observation that over 90% of all the craters on Mars are on the same side. That's kind of interesting. In fact, 82% of them appear, you can argue geometrically, may have all hit in the same hour. That's the only way to explain the mathematics that are involved, and I think it's one of the most simplest way to explain it. One of the possible conjectures is that Mars attracted a comet. Comets are usually made of ice. And when you get to the Roche limit is typically about 2.44 radii of the planet. It's a point at which the tidal forces in the approaching object are so severe it breaks up into pieces. It's called the Roche limit. A small object approaching a planet typically will break up at the Roche limit. That's what happened to the comet that approached Jupiter several years ago. That broke up into some 22 pieces and became known as Shoemaker-Levy. And a couple of years later, when it returned, those pieces, of course, at that time crashed into the planet, making that spectacular display that we talked about a few years back. Now, one of the theories about Mars is that this comet broke up the Roche limit, and the ice landing on the ground may have made the craters, but also melted to become the water that caused the erosion. And Mars, not having enough gravity to hold it, eventually evaporated into space. A reasonable explanation from what we know about the circumstances. There are some other factors that cause some people to conjecture that this short flood on Mars may have occurred at the same time, for some interesting reasons, that the flood on the Earth did in the days of Noah. And it's possible that there's a mathematical relationship between the two, and we'll explore some of that later. But let's move on with this issue here. Jim Papicki, director of the Institute of Meteoritics at the University of New Mexico, has said, quote, "We have concluded that our measurements give no evidence of life." And he's studying for over a year the 4.5-pound potato-sized meteorite that we're dealing with. It's contained pyrite samples which contain two sulfur isotopes, sulfur-32 and sulfur-34, which the ratio of which changes on Earth in the presence of biological activity. Quote, "There's no evidence that is in the ratio for life forms. In fact, the ratio points in the opposite direction." And he's about to publish his paper in another journal. William Schopf of UCLA, who spent his career separating microfossils of early life on the Earth from imposters, said, "I think it's very unlikely they have remnants of biological activity." Now, these microfossils are from 20 to 100 nanometers in length. They're objects that are 100 times smaller than the smallest microfossils of ancient bacteria ever found on the Earth, Schopf points out. 100 nanometers, by the way, to give you a feeling, is about the size of the HIV virus. See, that's what we're dealing with here, if I recall correctly. Anyway, quoting Cornell exobiologist Carl Sagan, of all people, he's made the famous statement, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." And so Schopf quotes that back to him in rebuttal. Now, the meteorite that you'll see in the press, everyone's talking about, is ALH 84001. It's designated that way because the ALH refers, it was originally found in the Allen Hills region of Antarctica. That's the ALH. 84 is when it was found in 1984, and 001 was the first one logged in that year. It's about 1.9 kilograms. It's about the size of a softball or a potato, whatever you want to call it. And it didn't get any particular scrutiny for over 10 years. Found in 84. Some meteorites are believed by scientists to be chunks of the moon and the Mars that were blasted into space by large impacts. That always fascinates me because I thought there was an escape velocity very, very high to get out into orbit. But in any case, that is a view held by competent scientists about some things. Minerals in this particular sample, were initially written off as a common piece of detritus on the asteroid belt. But in 1994, David Mittelfeld of Lockheed Martin in Houston pointed out subtle similarities to known Martian meteorites, which stimulated further study. Now, these other meteorites that are compared, we don't really know they came from Mars anywhere, but they are regarded from Mars, and this particular thing started to have some chemical similarities to those particular meteorites, which caused people to start taking a second look. Now, this is a quote just to show you how scientific myth can be packaged as truth. Quote, "Radiometric dating suggests that ALH 8401 to have congealed from magma to become part of the original Martian crust 4.5 billion years ago, just 100 million years after the planet was formed, making it the oldest rock known from any planet. Still early in Martian history, a meteorite impact shattered the rock, leaving fractures where minerals, including possible traces of life, formed perhaps 3.6 million years ago. Much later, another impact launched the rock into space, where radioactive nuclei created by deep space radiation show that it wandered for 16 million years before blazing through the Earth's atmosphere and crashing into the Antarctic ice cap. There it lay buried for 13,000 years until scientists found it on the wind-scored ice in Allen Hills region of Antarctica, close quote. Now, you know, an awful lot of people will read that and sort of assume, well, that's scientific, fact. And, of course, as you recognize, that's just a whole string of conjectures laid end to end. But one of the questions that's on your mind, I'm sure, is how do we know it's from Mars? Well, NASA reports show that the concentration of xenon, krypton, neon, argon-36, argon-40, nitrogen, and CO2, gas trapped in the interior of the meteorites, almost exactly matches the values obtained by the Viking lander. So it's got some chemical similarities to materials that were picked up on Mars. But in that same NASA report, which you can find on the internet, it also has the following statement, quote, "Similar collisions of asteroids or comets with Earth could have blasted rocks into escaping orbits that eventually carried them to Mars. Some of these rocks could have been large enough to shield any dormant spores or microbes inside them for millions of years against the sterilizing effects of the solar and cosmic radiation. Some of the rocks could have broken apart when they landed on Mars. This leads to an intriguing speculation. A few billion years ago, when Mars still had water on its surface, could the planet have been seeded by organisms carried in meteorites from the Earth?" Interesting. If you're going to play that game, it works both ways. What NASA doesn't mention, but I'll just point out, from a solar wind point of view, Mars is downwind. It's more natural for detritus in space in the region of the Earth to be migrated to Mars than coming uphill. Follow me? Just a comment. Now, one major flaw with this whole scenario is that meteorites pick up organic debris, even small pores that are in the stratosphere, as they enter the atmosphere. Presumably, these molten meteorites would preserve many such particles as they cool off. And, of course, the solar wind has the ability to carry organic debris from Earth to the planet Mars because, of course, it is downwind. All these are conjectures, but the real point is the conjectures that NASA is going to are pretty wild. Now, there are a few examples of meteorites discovered on Earth which match the composition of rocks on Mars. It's believed that these rocks were ejected to escape velocity by a large impact on Mars and find themselves to Earth and captured by its gravity. And many scientists believe that's possible. Whether it is or not, who knows, but there are competent people that believe that that's reasonable. And especially since Mars does bear all kinds of evidence of impacts. But this idea of one being 13,000 years in age is another whole issue. See, of the assumptions we're dealing with, the first assumption that's involved is claiming that this is evidence of life on Mars. Well, it assumes that the rock, first of all, is from Mars. Its composition makes this a possibility, but it cannot be proven to be Mars. And it's not impossible the object was ejected from Earth and then went to Mars and then came back. But you stop and say, well, that's kind of, for the same rock to go through 3 trips is a little, shaky. Secondly, there is an assumption that when the object left Mars, the organic compounds and fossil structures were present inside. This also cannot be proven, but it's a possibility. It's also possible, as evolutionists have acknowledged, that a rock could be ejected from the Earth long ago by large impact, orbit the sun for some years, then be captured by Mars. Again, multiple hops for the same rock is a little shaky. A third assumption is that the structures and the chemicals found are indeed fossils of microbial life and have no other origin from non-living processes. So scientists have stated, however, that both organic compounds and the ion compounds found could have other natural origins. So you can go on and tear this to pieces. The real question is, what are the motivations behind all this excitement for some guys to, in sincerity, make some observations and publish the possibilities is one thing. That's understandable. But what's amazing is how first of all, the scientific world has jumped on this as if it was some big, profound discovery. It's obviously a gigantic extension of the facts. As one person quipped, it's making vast conclusions from half-vast data. But you got to say that very carefully, I understand. But it's also important for us to be sensitive to the gigantic applause and response of the press and the secular world to this, how they leap and cling to these gigantic conclusions from this report. And you quickly sense that there's a gigantic motivation on the part, especially of the so-called scientific community, to promote the idea of evolution, because that's a theory in big, big trouble. It's a theory that underlies our entire society, our vocabulary, and almost every field of endeavor, not just cosmology, but everything in our philosophical life derives from that. And there's a gigantic perceived need to promote this and to convince that life didn't evolve here on the earth. You know what's so strange is even if you grant that life evolved elsewhere and was transplanted here, which is a popular theme, don't believe it's true, but even if you grant that, it doesn't solve their problem. It still evolved in their mind, and it has to have a beginning. The discoveries in all fields of science in the 20th century demonstrate that there was a beginning. That time is a physical property. It had a beginning. The great singularity, etc. Now, this whole quest by NASA and Carl Sagan and all these SETI guys, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, are seeking this issue. Well, we are not alone in the universe. You always see that quip. We are not alone. I've got news for him. We never have been. We've never been alone in the universe because we were created not by accident, but by an incredibly skillful God. And he went through a lot of trouble. The intricacies of our universe and the most incredible intricacies of our own existence are staggering. And the problem is he did it for a purpose. He didn't do this as a casual venture. He has a purpose. He's communicated with us. We have in our hands 66 books written by 40 guys over thousands of years that are an integrated message that you can prove had its origin from outside the dimension of time altogether. But you see, that's scary to them, because if there's a God that created us, then that God has a purpose in us. And that God has a purpose in us, then that implies responsibility to something. And that's frightening to some. And so we are beneficiaries of an infinite, transcendent God, a transcendent God who is not only outside our creation, but can enter it and has, that we might have a destiny with him far beyond the constraints of the physical universe we find ourselves in. Now, this particular press release and the particular technical articles you'll see in all the magazines over the coming weeks will be intriguing, but as you look through them, even as a layman, you'll begin to realize that they are conjecture upon conjecture upon conjecture, and frail at the very outset. But this is healthy, because this is sort of like a warning shot across our bow, because there's going to be other things coming. Now, you can quickly dismiss some of the enthusiasm of NASA as motivated by their desperate attempt to gain public favor for funding. Hoagland is one of these guys that has been going around trying to promote interest in this peculiar face that has been observed on Mars. Viking 1 on orbit 35 around Mars back in that mission captured a photograph of a peculiar, and we'll show you that next time we get together. We'll project it, show it to you. But there is a face, apparently, on Mars. And there's some other structures, too, that are intriguing, but not quite as dramatic as this particular face. This thing that looks like a face is a mile across. This is not some little aberration. And what's disturbing about its structure is that it's symmetrical. It resembles, in the opinion of many, very much like the face that you'd expect on the Sphinx of Egypt. Now, that's been disfigured because Napoleon's artillery officers decided to use it for cannon practice, as you know, if you visited there. But the point is, the face on Mars is often compared to the face on Sphinx. But what's disturbing about the face is that it looks symmetrical. Now, scientists are divided. Some say it's just an aberration, and some feel that it's a structure that was fabricated for a purpose. And Hoagland has been pleading with NASA to take it seriously. NASA has avoided this subject like the plague in the past. I think they were fearful of a repeat of the Von Daniken foolishness of years ago. But with this new bent at NASA, it would not surprise me at all to see proposals from NASA to Congress. They already have organized all kinds of proposals to make the research on Mars a high priority. But will they send a rover to the Cydonia region of Mars to find out more about these apparent structures that are on Mars? That's an interesting question. And it'll be interesting for me to watch because they've avoided Hoagland like the plague, and yet at the same time, at this point, their goals may start to coincide because NASA, of course, is desperate for funding. And so we'll watch that and watch the missions that they're planning. Now, most of these missions take many, many years in planning and preparation. So you're talking, years 2003, 4, or 5, that kind of planning horizon, I believe. Now, the reason I get into this is that, first of all, as far as the fury that you're going to hear about all this stuff, there really isn't any evidence of fossil life. It's only some similarities in appearance of certain things. It may be just Martian chemistry. If it does turn out to be fossil life, it could easily have been contaminated by the Earth, either prior or during the reentry, what have you. Those arguments will go on. It's also very likely, or possible, I should say, that it's not a rock from Mars at all. It just happens to have some similarities, because after all, it is a meteorite and subject to a lot of abuse in the past. The whole idea that the evidence that's Martian is based on the amount of argon and these gases in it. And that also requires us to presume that the amount of argon in Mars's atmosphere has not changed over the last 3 billion years, which in itself is unlikely and tends to undermine the proposed evidences. And furthermore, especially since there's all this volcanism and other catastrophic impacts on Mars throughout the visible years. So the real point is, expect, not from this, but don't be surprised if scientists over the coming months or years announce that they've discovered life in space. And they may find situations that are not as specious as this one. What does that mean? Now, the Bible doesn't really say there's no life out there, although let me hastily add that it's my personal belief, from my perspective from the Bible, it would surprise me enormously if there is life, alien life out there in the form that is commonly presented in science fiction episodes. Because if there's life, I've got 2 questions to ask. Is the life that's out there, should there be some, is it sinless? See, if it is sinless, we got a problem, because there's some scripture that would contradict that. If it's not sinless, did Christ die for it? We know he died only once and for all on the cross. And I find it hard to imagine some life forms on the planet Jupiter or someplace finding salvation because of an event that occurred on a cross in Judea on the earth. In other words, that doesn't mean it's not true. Doesn't mean somehow we may be very surprised, but my own horizon militates against that. So I personally do not expect to see life on other planets. At the same time, we serve an incredible creator, and so I think what we do is, number one, don't deny him and stick to his word and see what he teaches us. The main point I'm getting at, there is a theory that is associated with the evolutionists, and and it doesn't solve any problems, but they're very attracted to this notion. See, let me back up. Part of the problem that evolution faces is there was not enough time as our knowledge of time and the earth. There's 2 problems with evolution, aside from it's specious for a lot of reasons, but first of all, there's not enough time. See, how many generations does it take to, quote, if you even grant their premises, for life to evolve? Another way of asking the question, how many generations have occurred in the history of the universe? If the scientists say that the universe is about 15 billion years old, then the question is, well, how many generations of life forms is that? Well, what's the average lifetime? Let's assume that the average lifetime in the history of the universe is 1 second. Then there are only 10 to the 17th generations. That's not a very big number, but it turns out a bigger number than most people realize. It would take 10 to the 1000th power, not 10 to the 17th, to accomplish the switching theory implications of the DNA molecule, just to name one. And for having only 10 to the 17th seconds is a problem. Well, let's assume that some early some variations here were nanoseconds long. Well, that's still only 10 to the 26th. You see, you just don't have enough time. The other problem you have is there's not enough material for the trials. You see, the universe is finite. The scientific estimates is that there's only about 10 to the 80th particles in the universe. There's only about 10 to the 66th atom in the universe. And so if you're going to make trial and error runs, and throw the stuff away, you haven't got enough material. It's the reality of that mathematics that has caused the honest evolutionists to realize that evolution couldn't have occurred on the Earth. And so that's why they're attracted to this notion that, gee, maybe it occurred elsewhere and got transplanted here. And that leads to all these theories that are called panspermia. And this gets into science fiction scenarios such as an intergalactic mission that's approaching our solar system. Its main enemy in readjusting to a gravitational environment is gravity itself, and the gravity at Mars is 1/6 that of the Earth. So while it's an inhospitable planet, it could be a staging base before availing the mission of the attractive resources on the planet Earth, because the planet Earth has the largest range of chemistry of all the planets. So it's an attractive place, presumably. So you get into all these fascinating conjectures and fictional scenarios, but you'll run into these ideas that, well, Mars was a staging base for life on the Earth. Why am I getting into all of this? Well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, let's, at long last, take a look at the Scripture. And let's just look at some passages that I know you're familiar with, but let's just refresh our memory again. Let's take a look at the first epistle in the New Testament. Right after the book of Acts, you encounter the book of Romans. And let's just jump in here and pick it up about verse 18. Romans chapter 1, verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth, that is the truth of God, in unrighteousness. Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath shown it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even as eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. See, this is the rebuttal to the so-called heathen problem. What about the heathen person who's never been presented the gospel? What this passage says, God can hold him accountable just with the presentation of the creation around him. That's what it's saying. That for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even as eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Now, you want to talk about vain imagination? Boy, read these NASA reports. Now, I'm not trying to be glib or knock them, and yet one of the myths in our society that's hard to overcome is this myth that somehow scientists are objective. And indeed, they have a high ethic in their profession. They try to be on the one hand. At the same time, they are people. And you'll discover very quickly, if you look at them honestly, is that like people, they cling to their beliefs very, very tenaciously. And in the history of science, it's actually quite colorful to look through. We'll do a study coming up probably called The Myths of Science. If you study the history of science, you'll discover that scientists have embraced myths that were subsequently disproved by experiment. But what's interesting is how long it took the scientific world to accept the new findings. There are many, many, many examples of that. The one that's most familiar to me is the speed of light. For up till Descartes, they felt it was instantaneous, or putting another way, that light traveled at infinite speed. And it was a Danish astronomer by the name of Olaf Romer that by measuring the eclipses of Io at different places on the orbit of Jupiter, when it was close, it was far away, by measuring that eclipse, he could thus get an interesting baseline on the speed of light, and concluded that the speed of light was at roughly 300,000 kilometers per second. And so it's interesting that his experiment proved that. It took 50 years of heated debate in papers where they just poo-pooed Romer's results until Bradley, an Englishman, repeated the experiment, and then it took 50 years for them to accept the fact that the speed of light was a finite number. And you can go after many, many examples. The important point is to recognize scientists are people, and they cling to their values and beliefs just as tenaciously as any other field of intense study. Many of them are sincere, and yet at the same time recognize that they are frail like all of us. But anyway, let's moving on here. They are without excuse, verse 21, because when they knew not God, they glorified him not as God. See, God's position is they knew God by looking around. But they didn't glorify him, neither were they thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the one incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man and birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things, the illusion of these representations of other ideas called idols. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Very key passage in Romans chapter 1. I encourage you to read the whole chapter at leisure, but let's pop over to the next epistle, chapter 1, 1 Corinthians. Let's pick it up about verse 20. Paul's going to talk about wisdom and foolishness here. And in verse 20 he says, "Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this age? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For after that, in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe." You know, it's interesting. It's not your intellect that will bring you to God. That doesn't mean you park your brains at the door when you enter a church. That's not what it says. Peter admonishes us to be ready always to give every man a reason of the hope that is within you, with all meekness and fear. But if it was your reason that saved you, then only the very, very smart people would be saved. That's not God's way. Your reason, your intellect, is a tool that God has put at your disposal to bear fruit with. But it's not the thing that determines it. Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? And remember, whenever you read a scientific report, you're typically reading the wisdom of this world. For after that, in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. For the Jews require a sign, the Greeks seek after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Gentiles foolishness. But unto them who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. And I always like verse 25, because to me it contains the ultimate oxymoron. We always joke about oxymorons. What's an oxymoron? Well, that's a self-contradictory phrase, like military intelligence or engineering commitment, or thinking liberal or whatever. Okay. They would say, or compassionate conservative, whatever. Okay. The foolishness of God. How can you construct a phrase like that? And yet Paul does. And it's fascinating when you springboard from this verse to stand back and look at the Bible and look at God's dealing with mankind. On the one hand, you can almost feel his frustration as he goes to such extremes to provide for his people, and they are stubborn, obstinate. I mean, it's amazing. You look at the history of Israel, and you look at them, and you shake your head, and then you realize we're the same way, if not worse. But the other thing you notice, how God seems to go out of his way to do things weird. He decides to scrub the whole place down, to start all over, and save 8 people. And he does it by putting them in a barge. The whole Noah story is weird. To save those, go through that whole rigmarole. And yet he does. He has his purposes. And you can go right through this again and again and again. You see God doing things in weird ways. They sin, so there's a plague of serpents, and Moses prays. So he says, okay, I'll save them. But the way he saves them, he has Moses make a brass serpent, put it on a pole, and raise it, put it on top of the mountain. Everybody that looks up there and sees it is spared. Death, those that don't die. 70,000 died. This is no small little incident. And you say, gee, if God's going to say, what a weird way to save them. You wonder, why did he do that? And Jesus explains it to you in John 3, because it's a model of the cross. But as you go through the scripture, you see God seems to go out of his way to do things what you and I would consider foolish ways to do things. We could spend an evening going through a list of these, just going through the Bible, story by story. You'll discover each story is weird. But what is the weirdest thing of all? What is the most bizarre mechanic that God uses in the entire history of the universe? And that's to measure everything, not just you and I, everything, by a cross that was erected in Judea some 2,000 years ago. A love story written in blood on that wooden cross, erected by Romans between two thieves. Interesting. And that's exactly what Paul says here in verse 18. Paul says, "For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us who are saved it is the power of God." Now there's another aspect of this verse that's disturbing. You realize that God divides the world into two parts. For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us who are saved is the power of God. Everyone in this room is in one of two places, either perishing or saved. Very disturbing bifurcation here. But we've been looking at a particular foolishness having to do with life on Mars. Turn with me to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. In many respects, probably one of the most important prophecy chapters in the New Testament. And Paul is talking here about the coming world leader who has 33 titles in the Old Testament, 13 in the New. And in this passage, several of them emerge. In verse 3, this coming world leader is called the man of sin, or the son of perdition. Verse 4, who poseth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. And this, of course, is talked about in Daniel. It involves what Daniel calls the abomination of desolation. Jesus, when he gives a confidential briefing to his 4 disciples on his second coming, makes reference to this key event, quoting Daniel in several places, Daniel 9 and Daniel 12 in various ways, and deals with this very issue. This is a major, major global political event when this coming world leader does exactly what it says here. He's going to oppose and exalt himself above all that is called God. Now, everyone that studies these passages knows that he'll probably, in some respects, he's going to be accepted as a Messiah by the Jews. He'll be accepted as a ruler by the Christian world. He is called the Antichrist. The word anti in the Greek really means in place of. Not anti, he is against Christ, but that's the point, is the term really means in the place of. And the Latin equivalent phrase to the Greek is the vicar of Christ. But in any case, he is also going to exalt himself above Allah. He will be embraced by the Muslim world. If you want some clues, you can check Muslim eschatology as to what they are expecting, because we do know he's going to meet everyone's apparent expectations. And he's going to establish himself in the temple of God. That's in Jerusalem. Jesus makes reference to it, and John also makes reference, as well as Paul. That's why we're so excited about the preparations that are beginning to build the temple. But he goes on here. Paul points out to the Thessalonians, remember not when I was with you, I told you these things. And you now know that what restraineth, that he might be revealed in his time. For the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Only he who now hindereth will continue to hinder until he be taken out of the way. Now, the only thing that ever hindered sin is God. And this is a reference to the Holy Spirit. And I won't get into all that here tonight. Our time's too short. But then he says, verse 8, and then shall that wicked one be revealed. And if you study our commentary in Thessalonians, where we go into this more carefully, you'll discover that the removal of the Holy Spirit in his indwelling relationship with the church is what's in view here. The church will be removed, I believe, before this world leader will be revealed. And then there's a forecast here. Whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming. Even him whose coming is after the working of Satan with all power and signs and lying wonders. All power and signs and lying wonders. Let me remind you one more time that there's a coming world leader coming that will do miracles. These same Greek words that are used here are used of the miracles of Jesus Christ. These aren't little showboat things. These aren't little conjuring tricks. Somehow, they are going to be substantial deceptions involved. But it goes on. Verse 10. And with all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, because they received not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this cause, God shall send them strong delusion that they should believe the lie. There's a definite article there. The lie. There's a specific lie. That they might also be judged who believe not the truth, but had pleasure in righteousness. Now, some scholars build on this passage the view that if you don't accept Jesus Christ before the rapture, if you've had a chance, an opportunity to accept him and don't, you won't get a second chance. That's controversial. Some people don't agree with that view. Some people say, gee, when I discover all my Christian friends are gone, that's when I'll get my Bible out and repair the damage. Well, there is some theologians that say that ain't the way it's going to work. But I won't jump into that controversy. I'll just alert you to that, not to jump to the conclusion that you have a chance, having had a chance prior to the rapture of the church. But in any case, the more particular issue, it speaks here that God will send them a specific lie. And there are many conjectures by people who study the Scripture as to what that lie specifically might be. And I'm not going to take you through an inventory of those. There are several. But certainly it's reasonable to include in a candidate list of lies evolution in its extreme form. Clearly that's a lie of Satan that undergirds our entire society today. It's an ungodly lie. It's the thing that serves Satan's purposes. We should not be surprised as we get closer and closer to what the Bible calls the end times to discover corroborating evidence, in quotation marks, to demonstrate evolution. That should not surprise you. If scientists discover things on Mars that are more substantial than the current press releases, don't be startled. But there's another dimension to this that's also provocative. Jesus referred to his second coming as being analogous to the days of Noah. He said, as the days of Noah were, so shall the days of the coming of the Son of Man be. Now, he might be simply making the point in that passage that just as they were buying and selling in business as usual until Noah went in the ark, his remark may mean only that much. However, it's possible, and one can argue, the possibility at least, that Jesus might have been using that term in a little broader way. It certainly is interesting to understand the days of Noah. Most people who read their Bible have the slightest notion of what really was going on in Genesis chapter 6 because of some myths that occurred in the 4th century onward. What the Bible clearly teaches, and is clear from the ancient commentators on those passages, is that the B'nai Elohim came unto the daughters of men. And the B'nai Elohim was an Old Testament term for angels, used 4 times in the Old Testament. And some very strange goings-on occurred. That gave rise to some very strange offspring called the Nephilim. The word means the fallen ones. And both James, the brother of Jesus Christ in his epistle, and Peter in his second epistle make reference to these fallen angels who are presently chained in a special place awaiting the final judgment. The goings-on, these demigods, if you will, these strange creatures that contaminated the purity of the genealogies of the people living at that time was the part of the problem that God was dealing with. And Noah, it says, was perfect in his teteliodoth, his generations. He was in a line that was not yet contaminated by these goings-on, which is one of the reasons, apparently, God chose him to continue after the flood. That's a whole study that I encourage you to get into, either to get the briefing on the flood of Noah or just do a careful study with competent background on Genesis chapter 6. The days of Noah are, to me, much more interesting than the flood of Noah. Why did the flood have to come? There's much information about that. The lines of Seth argument was a contrivance to avoid embarrassment in the 4th century that's endured to the current day among those that haven't really gone carefully into the text.